In 1939, Hitler's army began their conquest of mainland Europe and northern Africa, quickly overrunning the countries surrounding Germany through the use of blitzkrieg. Europe was taken in a short time. The New Forest, like the rest of the country at the outbreak of war, had already begun to prepare for the long slog ahead. Grand houses and hotels in the forest were requisitioned for use by the military and were also prepared to receive evacuees and bombed out families.
I was drafted to HMS Mastodon, which is in the New Forest.
The Barwon Hotel was taken over at the beginning of the war by the military, and so was the Carey's Manor, Lawnside in Merritt Road, Orchard House and Nethermore.
The Polygon Hotel in Southampton, which was taken over by the Royal Navy.
The New Forest, with its mix of open heathland, dense woodland and sparse population, was ideal for its use as a centre of military activity. Work started early in the 1940s to transform parts of heathland into airfields, now that the enemy was only miles away in France. In all, 12 airfields were built and operational during the war, including Beaulieu, Leeds-or-Point, Ippsley and Herne. These airfields all provided essential air support and forward landing ground for the Allies.
There was Holmesley was a big airtime. Beaulieu was a massive place.
And we had two small runways, north-south and north-east, south-west. And it was covered with what they called Sommerfeld tracking.
All the roads were marked out for the parking of vehicles.
And again, of course, we did see the army digging up and widening the roads and camouflaging stuff, this, that, and the other.
The Wimpy lorries taking the gravel from Setley Pond up through to building the Stony Cross airfield.
They put hards down so the ships could get in, open their bow doors and load up.
The Newfoundlanders came over, lumberjacks, and worked in the forest. And then in 1943 came preparations for the D-Day.
As well as the airfields, the New Forest also hosted other sites important to the success of D-Day. Mulberry harbours were built in Marchwood and Leap and would become essential for securing the French coast, as would the pipeline under the ocean, or Pluto, which supplied vital fuel to the Allies across the Channel.
They decided that they were going to do Pluto, which was pipeline under the ocean.
3 days after D-Day, they started building what they called Port Mulberry, this artificial port.
It took about, I think, 2 or 3, couple of weeks probably to get that Mulberry Harbour really organised.
They'd sunk, I don't know how many, 6 or dozen old merchant ships, about 3/4 of a mile offshore, parallel with the shore, and then between, they were the breakwater, and then between them and the shore, what looked like a complete mess of concrete and girders and, I don't know, all these prefabricated caissons and pontoons and things that they'd built on the south coast and towed across. And they were connected to the shore by what we call Bailey bridges. Like that, they were all lattice metal.
We put the pipeline from Leap Beach across to the Isle of Wight, flexible pipes, which is what they were going to use in the actual invasion. Then HMS Manxman and HMS Welshman, which were mine layers, were used with great reels at the stern of the ship with these flexible pipes on, and they were run across to France after D-Day.
As D-Day approached, troops and equipment began to build up in hastily constructed camps of tents and Nissen huts, and normal life began to be affected.
Well, the major signs were the arrival on trains of tanks and trucks.
The Winnipeg and Rejoinder rifles, they'd all been stationed around the forest here.
More troops started to arrive with vehicles in the village. Then we had a one-way system. And the first noticeable thing about that was that the Hanson Dorset Bus Company had to reduce the buses travelling between Lyndhurst and Lymington to single-deckers so that they could get under the Sway Road railway bridges.
The small LCIs, the infantry ones which carried so many troops, of course, there was hundreds of those there. hundreds. Yeah. As you say, you could have almost fought across the Isle of Wight on them.
We entertained the troops, offered them facilities for have baths.
I remember, none of them were too unhappy about it. It had to happen, you see.
Once we were shut up in the Green Jackets barracks, we saw people, but we never had any conversation with them. We weren't allowed to.
It flew 2 or 3 times a day, and then in the evening we'd get into a jeep and go up to the Montague Arms and have a few pints.
People, I suppose, were further back in different places around the other side of Lymington, Brockenhurst and all that sort of place.
It was exciting. You're standing there watching tanks and things come rumbling down, and getting a chance to climb up into a wireless truck and find out how all the different things worked.
When we were on these route marches and we went through a village, they all waved and shouted. And of course the chaps shouted back, but there was no conversation.
Week or maybe 2 weeks before, notices appeared on all the telegraph poles forbidding civilians to loiter or talk to the troops.
We was issued with courier passes because you couldn't come down to Portsmouth, you couldn't get into Portsmouth, and you couldn't get out Portsmouth without a pass.
Of course, the red caps were on the road junctions, and nobody was allowed into Brockenhurst who didn't have a special pass or their own identity card.
The war was also the first time that many people interacted with those from other countries. From the rich American troops to the European neighbours of France and Poland, there was a rich mixture of cultures in the forest. The lack of space and equipment in Britain at the time also meant that some of our troops had to train abroad.
There was no room to train us here. Because, not only did they go to America, they went to Canada and South Africa. There was just absolutely no room here, and of course we were accepted with open arms.
The Americans were very kind to us. Oh yeah.
They always had chewing gum and that to chuck around.
They seemed, I suppose we would have said they seemed a bit windy, but when you think about it, I mean, these are kids from Pittsburgh and the Middle West, and all they knew about the war was what they'd seen in Hollywood films, which were full of propaganda about how wonderful our equipment was, you know, and how the enemy would run as soon as we stood up, and of course it wasn't like that at all.
They had an excellence about them for getting things ashore, you know, getting their troops onto the beaches.
Oh, their equipment was 10 times better than ours, and the clothing was marvellous.
Well, they had a lot more than what we did. Yeah.
I mean, I didn't speak too good English at the time, but a Scottish, they'd never heard the accent before. So they used to ask me to stand up, you know, and say a few words, and I felt embarrassed and all that sort of stuff. But they were absolutely marvellous.
When we took these Americans over, they left me blankets, boots, everything, and the food they had peaches and cream and all this sort of stuff. They were not short of food. The Americans never went short of anything.
Our chaps we was listing on for up to D-Day. You'll love this. Dehydrated potatoes, dehydrated meat, dehydrated greens.
The Americans were paid 7 times as much as we were and had much smarter uniforms and no doubt better food.
You got one of these big tins, you opened it, slid this chunk of solid mass out, and you used a saw to cut it into cubes. Then you soaked it in water for 8 hours, and then you get a nice pulpy mess. Well, when we had our meals up to D-Day, we didn't take our knives and forks.
The difference again between the US Navy and the British Navy, we had a crew of about 83. The Americans, same ship, they were all American built anyway, the LSTs, they had a crew of about 120.
In a naval mess, you probably have a couple of those dustbins. That's for any stuff that you don't eat, you put in a gash and that went for the pigs. In this American mess, if I remember rightly now, there were 6 dustbins full and overflowing with uneaten chicken and food. And there's now chaps existing on dehydrated stuff.
Once the top brass had decided exactly what Operations Overlord and Neptune would be, preparations and training began to prepare the massive forces for what they were going to experience.
It was pretty hard going. One of the things, there was a huge 200-foot high mast, as if it had been taken off the Victory, in other words, and we had to go over the mast, as they called it, every morning before breakfast.
I went to a place called Asbury Park in New Jersey. It's about 40 miles from New York. And the British Navy, or the Royal Navy, had 2 hotels there.
When I was down at Portsmouth, we started rigging out Fort Southwick for D-Day. We didn't know what we were told. You know, you cameras here, there's a map there. We didn't know what it was. I mean, it wasn't secured then.
Whilst we were there to keep us fit, we went on 27-mile route marches around the area under a strict guard.
And then we went down to New Orleans and we picked up this LSTs, which were built all on the Mississippi.
The senior naval officer sent for me in the mess and said that he had a special job for me to do the next day. Would I get my men falling in at 4 o'clock in the morning? Transport would be provided and we would be bussed, as he called it, down to Devon.
We went down the West Country, sort of a mock invasion. You knew that D-Day wasn't far off.
Montgomery had said, if you're going to be exercising on my beaches, you're going to have a beach organisation. And if you haven't got one, I'll say you get one. And that was me.
A rehearsal then for the D-Day landings, and it was a very, very foggy morning. We got down there, and this Dutchman come out, and it is broadside on. And of course the ship went over.
But it wasn't until the Americans sent ashore their own, a battalion of their own men, to act as defenders of the beach, and we realised they were setting up machine guns with live ammunition to make it realistic, that things started to go wrong.
Took part in a mock invasion down the West Country. Perhaps some people can remember that a lot of the Americans were lost there because the E-boats come up there and sunk several of the landing craft.
The other thing was the landing craft coxswains, the chap who drove the landing craft, was dropping his ramp far too early. And the consequence is that as soon as the ramp goes down, of course, all the soldiers inside are supposed to rush ashore. Well, they were in over their heads. And the next thing that happens is that the landing craft reverses when all the troops are. It sucked them all back again, and a lot of them are drowned.
We were paraded one day in a field, and the major stands up and said, and they always affected this sort of rather clipped accent, like Laurence Olivier. Well, men, we're going over to Normandy shortly, and I want you to look at the chap on either side of you. One of you won't be coming back.
Tragedies aside, once the troops had completed training, they are ready and well prepared to face the enemy in the most ambitious and complicated military operation to date.
I think they got a bit bored towards the end.
First of all, we fiddled around under canvas at Aldershot. Didn't know what to do with us. Route marches, polish this and that sort of thing, you know, keep us busy.
But they were bored stiff. As you can imagine, we'd been brought right up to top pitch with all these exercises. We knew exactly what was going to happen. And then suddenly there's a waiting period where nothing's going on at all.
D-Day was a big secret day, of course, and we knew eventually, when we moved from Tangmere as squadrons, Typhoon squadron that we had at Tangmere, to Nidor Point, that something was happening.
To be honest, at that time, nobody had a clue. As I say, unless we knew that something was going on, but as I say, we saw the map, but we didn't know what it entailed.
The first time I actually knew about it was when they started putting the diesel pumps down, and they said it was for a big job.
On the evening of June the 5th, massed ranks of troops, vehicles, ships and aircraft began their journey to the north of France, with the intention of taking back Europe from Hitler's stranglehold. The 5 forces departed from ports all along the south coast, including Torquay, Weymouth, Poole, Southampton, Portsmouth and Shoreham. The American forces, Utah and Omaha, were the first to arrive at 6:30, with the British forces Gold and Sword and the Canadian force Juno arriving at 7:30. Each force was to occupy and clear their beach of enemy before moving on into the nearest village or town to do the same.
And on the 5th of June, we were all up at 4 o'clock in the morning and get briefed for this particular trip to Normandy. And of course it never happened because the weather was such that it was very awful, really.
We should have been there on the 5th, but it was delayed for 24 hours, so we sailed down from Belfast, where we were at the time, for about 3 weeks prior to the invasion. And then we went down as far as Plymouth and told to go back for 12 hours. And then about turn and come back 12 hours, so we'd be at the same spot, but 24 hours later.
The evening of June the 5th, I remember lying in bed and hearing this drone and looking out, and the sky was full of transport planes towing gliders. Dozens and dozens and dozens of them.
When dawn broke on the morning of the 6th of June, we could not believe the number of ships about.
I mean, it was ships everywhere, all around, you know. It was, they were packed in there like sardines, you know.
They took us round to Ventnor. It was like a car park.
But it was just, as I looked down, the most spectacular view I think anybody's ever had at 500 feet on D-Day. It looked to me as if the Isle of Wight were being towed out to sea, just like that.
When you had D-Day, a lot of them just disappeared overnight.
But we left the Solent on the 5th of June, late in the evening.
Every hour was to show that should anything happen to any one of the transports going from the ships, was hit a mine or something like that, although they were in tracks that were supposed to be mine free, you could always have a floating mine or something like that. They could then define what time that boat was sunk.
The great trip over the sea to Normandy was quite entertaining because I'd never been to sea, never been further than Weston-super-Mare in those days.
We weren't bothered because we were sailors, but I felt dreadfully sorry for the army. They were terribly ill.
So he decided to go, and we were airborne at 6:40 and crossed in just after 7 o'clock.
And we bombarded. Our first job was to bombard along the coast and the shore batteries there.
And we landed at 7:30 on the morning of the 6th of June.
Well, they were all, you know, pretty excited to go, you know. It's all, you're wondering what's going to happen, you know. It's all, you know, people turn around and say they're not scared. Don't you believe it? You do get scared at times.
For myself, I mean, when you're 16, it was very exciting. At that age, you don't realise the dangers you may be going into. You just think it's one big game, you know.
We knew it was coming, and we knew we had to do it. If you were selected to go on a mission, you had to go.
On the Glasgow, we had 6-inch guns, which was quite formidable, but the shore batteries there, they were 8-inch guns, so they could outgun us.
The noise was tremendous. I mean, there was the naval bombardment going on. There were rocket ships firing rockets over our heads, landing on the beach ahead of us. And of course there was return fire coming from the the shore. The racket was unbelievable.
But as we crossed out, we were being shot at by our own soldiers on the beachhead.
There were these dreadful things where they had crossed steels with mined shells on the top. If you caught on those, you had it. It just blew everything up. And sadly, the craft next door to mine did blow up.
So many people being pushed onto the beach. Thousands and thousands of men going up the beach. And they were being fired at very, very heavily. And you could see people falling, being injured and shot and killed.
Just shows you the incredible sense of humour of the British seamen in those sorts of difficulties. My petty officer was standing next to me by the ramp as it went down, and as this one blew up next door, and he put his arm out like that and said, "Butler fashion, after you, sir."
Most of the landing craft went back, but we were equipped. Directly, the tank deck was emptied. We had an arrangement where stretchers, 3 high, were all down, and we could bring back over 100, maybe 150 wounded, easy.
The chappie who tipped over backwards as he came off the landing craft, off the ramp, he literally disappeared, apart from, so what I could see was his glasses floating on top of the water apparently. So he had a very valuable piece of equipment, apart from I didn't want to lose a man. So I just grabbed hold, couldn't do anything else, grabbed hold of his webbing, slung him across my shoulder and ran up the beach with him. Something I could not in the ordinary way do.
It had to be absolutely 100% successful, otherwise we had never had a foothold.
It was so well organised, you know. I mean, it was a wonderful organisation to it.
On the day, it was absolutely spot on, because as I say, we didn't meet any obstacle at all that we were not prepared for.
We were on the go, we were moving, the British were winning.
After we'd cleared the beaches and set up our communication network, we stayed there after clearing the village as well, of course, until the end of July, when we were brought back here, having virtually finished our job. The bridgehead was well established, and we were given 7 days leave and packed off to Burma to do the same thing over there.
The success of D-Day meant that the Allies finally had a foothold in Europe from which to liberate the continent. Victory in Europe was achieved on May the 7th, 1945, and with the surrender of Japan on August the 10th, the war was finally over.
Well, I'd been transferred out to India by then.
And then I was posted back to the beachhead to complete the war, so from my point of view. And quite unexpectedly, I was posted as end of tour. I'd done 170 operational trips, which double the amount for one tour.
My opposite number and I were standing on the beach chatting one day. Beautiful day it was. And suddenly he said to me, because he was looking in that direction, I was pointing the other way, he said, "Ron," he said, "turn round." He said, "Am I dreaming?" So I turned around, and there was a column of soldiers with fixed bayonets coming round the headland, with an officer in front with his sword. And as it got closer, we could see he was a Japanese officer with his samurai sword, and he had about 80 men with him. I only had 12.
And we used to do shore patrols, because we used to get the old, what they called the Woolworth carriers, converted banana boats used to come in there with their crews, and they used to have a right old time ashore.
At any rate, he came marching up to us and said he wished to surrender, and gave me his sword. And I said, "Well, I must disarm your men, please." He said, "That's perfectly acceptable." So I whistled up some troops to take their weaponry away, and sat them all down at the back of the beach, sent for the army to take them away. Whilst we were waiting for the army, he was chatting. He'd been to Oxford, this chap, and he said, "You know, this has been a terrible business. awful war. This should never have happened. He said, we've hated it as much as I believe you have.
I came on leave, and by the time I got back, there was a ceasefire in operation, and VE Day was the next day.
I was on guard on the main gate, and the announcer came over that the war with Germany had ended, VE Day, and the captain in his good sense said 2 pints of white horse beer for all ratings. So the lads were going down and getting their 2 pints and coming back through the main gate because the NAAFI was outside the main gate. And as they were going by, they said, "Having a beer, Dick, have a beer, Dick." So I finished up with about 20 bottles of beer.
And I think that on BE Day was actually the day I got discharged.
They took us down to Bremen docks, and what do you think we did? We started cleaning and polishing everything. Normal army life of peacetime had already begun.
We were given 2 days off from school, and we built a large bonfire in the middle of the road, at the top of Avenue Road. It wasn't tarmacked in those days.
I spent VE Day walking around Cape Town trying to find a bar that had any drink at all. Because the Australians had been there and they drunk the bloody place dry.
We used to have a leave station up in the Nilgiri Hills, up from Metapalliam, it's about 8,000 foot up, beautiful leave station. And I was up there for the VJ Day.
VJ Day, I was over here in Leon Solent. And there was no bar in Leon Solent, believe you me.
The war was over. It was a relief, like it was to everybody else, I suppose. And there was lots of celebrations, and you know, everybody's had their say, all the politicians, this, that, and the other. And I think it was great for the country, and we'd won.
It was the relaxation of stress and tension more than anything else.
Absolutely mad. It was mad. I think everybody went mad. It was such a relief.
Well, I mean, everybody was celebrating. It was marvellous, really, because the job was all over.
Where you've had a bad accident or something like that, and you're fully fit again, that's the feeling, you know. Right, let's get on with it kind of thing.
And when we came into Liverpool, it was snowing, cold as Hades. If you can have it cold as Hades, and damn cold anyway. And but we were glad to be back.
As you get older, your mind begins to fill you, and I do think about all the pilots I knew in the war, and when I look back, they look so young. I just wonder what they'd look like today. You know? Oh yes, it's sad when you think of it.